it is important to recall the cross-cutting nature of human rights. The struggle against armed groups, peace, security and development, humanitarian action, climate change and the environment cannot be addressed in isolation from human rights. The exchanges focused on legislative, policy, and programmatic developments, progress, challenges, remaining gaps, and priorities for the future, based on the key benchmarks I highlighted in my previous reports submitted to the United Nations Human Rights Council. In addition, I held meetings with civil society representatives, including journalists, internally displaced persons, vulnerable and marginalized groups, minorities, migrants, and persons with disabilities, to exchange views on human rights issues of concern and to provide ideas on the way forward. I remain concerned about the impact the ongoing joint military offensive by the Somali National Army, local clan militias known as Community Defense Forces, and the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia has on the civilian population and infrastructure. The U.S. AFRICOM Command continues to carry out targeted airstrikes at the government's request and in support of the Somali National Army against Al-Shabaab. I urge all parties to uphold their responsibilities under human rights and international humanitarian law and ensure the protection of civilians. So that I can make a report. The risk of further clashes between Somaliland forces and clan militia contributes to insecurity and human rights violations. I reiterate my call for dialogue and urge all parties to refrain from divisive rhetoric. All grievances and tensions should be resolved peacefully and through dialogue. I am deeply concerned about reports of large numbers of detainees and expect that those involved to abide by human rights and international humanitarian law, in particular the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. The Ministry of Interior, Federal Affairs and Reconciliation also adopted policies and frameworks, including mapping conflict areas and the age verification policy. It also has been working through community engagement to foster integrity between the army and local communities, providing training on human rights and international humanitarian law, as well as conducting specialized training on women, peace and security. The Minister of Youth and Sports facilitated reconciliation and consultation sessions on youth, peace and security by organizing youth tournaments, forums and panel discussions. In the area of rule of law, the federal government reported that the Juvenile Justice Bill has been presented to the federal parliament and it has initiated an amendment to the prison law. I also note the federal government's request for technical assistance to improve and accelerate the process of legal drafting. The use of the Somali Penal Code against journalists and media workers, and the constant threat of being arrested, held in detention, and subjected to trials, fines, and imprisonment leads to self-censorship. Female genital mutilation is a harmful traditional practice which continues in Somalia and violates the right to health and the right to life often resulting in the death of victims. In particular, the work on the 30% minimum quota has been ongoing by the female members of parliament through their two caucuses. In addition, the Federal Minister of Women and Human Rights Development reported that she has initiated the Women's Leadership Technical Committee to advocate with the National Consultative Council on women's issues, including the 30% representation of women in public life and the constitutional review process.
Have claimed the lives of many people living in Baidoba, Burhakaba, Birdale, and part of Kido region. The people who have suffered
Some have been internally displaced persons camps for 20 years are unable to return to their areas of origin, while others have lost farms and animals because of the conflict, drought, and floods. Their children do not go to school, there are no nutrition programs for them, and the minimal humanitarian and aid received is used to compensate landowners for living on their land. Their greatest need is shelter, nutrition, employment, education, and health care. To this end, I welcome the adoption by the federal government, with support from its partners, of the enactment of the Regulatory Control Act for materials depleting the ozone layer and the Environment Management Bill of 2023, which brings the nexus between humanitarian aid and development. I understand that it has been approved by the federal cabinet and is waiting assent by parliament. I also commend the age verification guidelines signed by the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, which will assist age assessment and should be applied consistently by the federal government. However, I note that the National Action Plan on Children has not yet been adopted. I reiterate the call made by the Secretary General's report on children and armed conflict of June 2023 for all parties to immediately cease and prevent violations and to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. I stress the need to continue prioritizing the protection of children in light of the phased ATMIS drawdown.
My name is Muhammad Abdul Mohammed. I'm from
Should be used technically in terms of the work of the media. But that also, based on the commitments made and priorities identified by the federal government, I have requested to visit the country again in April or May next year to assess progress on the human rights situation and follow up on how gaps and challenges are being overcome by the authorities and priorities are being implemented. This will help inform the development of options on possible adjustments to the scope of the mandate to better respond to the technical assistance needs of the federal government, with a view to revising the focus and scope of the mandate and improving the ability to support Somalia's efforts to implement human rights standards and norms.